Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Whenever you might be watching this, I hope you are doing well. And if you're not, it's okay. It's okay not to be doing well. I am Richard Watkins, your humble host of the Richard Watkins Podcast. I'm so excited to be with you today. We try to bring the very best content to you. We've had some amazing guests over the past few weeks. We've had amazing conversations. We've touched on air quality. We've touched on public education. We've touched on local politics. We've also touched on technology, artificial intelligence. But even though we bring in amazing guests, I try to come to you every so often, and I'm trying to make it once a month, where I can just sit and talk with you about current issues, pressing topics, or just topics that I find interesting. So I hope you too will find it interesting as you join me on the latest, greatest episode of Richard Watkins Podcast. And I'm actually going to try to say something, every single podcast that goes a little something like this. The more we learn, the more we realize how very little we know. So sit back, relax, let's learn something today. Now, I think there's a lot of topics that we can get in today, and we're just going to try to cover two topics, right? Here we're sitting here on a Friday. What's the date? Just make sure I got it right. Friday, July 19th. Yesterday, just wrapped up the Republican National Convention, in which Donald Trump was made the official nominee of the Republican Party for President of the United States of America. I mean, it's huge, huge, huge deal. Now, their opponent may be President Joe Biden, who is running for re-election. And the only reason I say maybe is because if you haven't been paying attention to the news, there has been a lot of conversation regarding whether or not President Joe Biden should or should not run for reelection. And people have a wide variety of reasons, but a lot of the conversation involves his age, with people saying he should step down because he doesn't seem like he can continue doing the job, while supporters are saying, no, he is the party's best option to maintain the presidency. Regardless of what side you fall on, this election coming up is going to be absolutely historic. I mean, there are few positions in the world as powerful as the president of the United States, the chief executive of the executive branch of the United States government. Just really quickly, there are three branches of the US government. We have the legislative branch, we have the judicial branch, and we have the executive branch. And the president is the head of the executive branch of government. Very, very important. Also, very, very important is going to the polls and voting, whether it be the primary or the general. This is very, 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 very important because in the general election, it is decided who then goes on to become president, but it is not as simple as that. I go to the barbershop, I'm at church or what have you, and there's always a lot of conversations about everything that goes into it. If you turn on the television, you've seen commercials. If you turn on Facebook, you see ads, so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of initiative to get folks out to vote. get folks out to vote. But it's really important to realize all that goes in to selecting a president. First, let's start with the parties. The two major parties in the United States, as many of you know, is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. These two parties are the oldest parties, or some of the oldest parties in the entire world. Okay, just so you know. And the infrastructure of those two parties is incredible, absolutely incredible, right? There's a saying that goes, all politics is local. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means as we go on to describe the process of selecting the President of the United States. But before I go any further, I just want to give a huge shout out to the organization that makes this here podcast possible, the Science Policy Action Network, the world leader in scientific consulting and scientific lobbying. If you are a scientist and you are working to get more funding for your research, come check out the Science Policy Action Network. They represent science. They work to make sure science and innovation is supported at the highest level, the highest possible level, making sure people have all the information that they need as innovation goes at breakneck pace. There are many people who are afraid of being left in the dust, but the Science Policy Action Network is here to support you, whether you're a community organizer or a policymaker. Science Policy Action Network is here to have your back. If you're looking for more information, check out the Science Policy Action Network at www.span-inc.org. That is www.span-inc.org. Now, with that commercial out of the way, let's get right into it. Let's talk a little bit about how the president is elected. So, one thing that you absolutely have to know is that the president of the United States is not elected by the voter. It's very, very important to understand. The decision of who becomes the leader of the executive branch of the United States government is conducted in what is referred to as a representative democracy. So they are not selected by the popular vote. In fact, roughly 11% of all presidents throughout the course of history have been elected against the popular vote, meaning the person who won the majority of the votes lost the race to be the president of the United States. That is very, very important to realize. I think most notably, was Hillary Clinton when she lost the race for the president of the United States against Donald Trump, who was victorious. Hillary Clinton won in the popular vote by a few million votes. However, because the president is elected not by the popular vote, but by the vote of the electoral college, he still lost because Donald Trump won the majority of the electoral college votes. That is critically important to remember, okay? So the president of the United States is not elected via popular vote. They are elected by the electoral college. That is very, very important to realize, okay? Very, very important to realize. And again, I just want to stress, roughly 11% of all the presidents ever elected were elected despite the fact that they lost in regards to the popular vote, okay? But how did they get a chance to run for president anyway for their respective parties? They are able to run for their respective parties because they become the nominee of their respective party. They become the nominee for their respective party. Okay, that's really, really important. So the Republican National Convention just ended last night. And after it ended, Donald Trump became the nominee for the Republican Party for the president of the United States. He became the nominee at that point. Before the convention, technically, he is just a candidate. He is not the nominee. He is just a candidate. Same is true for the Democratic side of the equation. For the Democratic Party, Joe Biden technically at this moment is a candidate for president of the United States of America. He is not the nominee. He will not become the nominee until after the Democratic National Convention, which will be held in a few weeks in Chicago. That is very, very, very important to realize, okay? But the same thing that holds true for the general basically holds true for the primary process as well. Now, what we mean by primary process, most of you already know what this is, but very quickly, for the folks who may not keep up with politics very much, the primary is the election that happens within the election to determine who represents their respective party. Okay? So there's a primary that's held for the Democratic Party, and there's a primary that is held for the Republican Party. Primaries don't have to happen, right? Pretty much at this point, the Democrats haven't had a real primary with candidates running, debates happening. That has not happened because oftentimes what happens when you have an incumbent, such as the case with the Democrats, the party rallies behind the incumbent who is seeking reelection to increase the likelihood that that person, that incumbent, is reelected. That's what generally happens. And so often primaries do not occur in the case of an incumbent seeking a reelection. They can happen, but quite often they don't happen so that the party can pool its resources and energy behind supporting that particular candidate. It is very, very important to realize because you'll hear things that this person is already the nominee or this person already had a primary. That is not always technically the case, okay? A person who wins the official nomination by their party is the person who wins the majority of not voters, but delegates. All right, let me just say that again. The person who ultimately wins the nomination of their respective party is not the person that wins the most votes, but wins the most delegates. So both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have immense infrastructure. There's a saying that goes, all politics is local, and that means a wide variety of things, but it is especially true when we talk about the infrastructure of these two parties. In general, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party starts at the very local level. It starts at the precinct level, which is a geographical space, pretty small, that has a precinct leader or precinct chair that holds meetings. So people in that very small geographical area are able to discuss issues that are important to them, values that they want to see supported by their party, and so on and so forth. Every so often, usually annually, usually not always, but usually annually, the next step above that is the county. In most cases, the county has their own convention which is held annually, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. You see how we're kind of building this. So precincts represents the concerns of a very small geographical area. And then that then goes on to the county level, where each precinct sends a delegate to represent that particular precinct. So at a county convention, delegates are there to represent the issues that mean the most to the people that live in their precinct. Also at these county conventions, a county party platform is created. In general, a platform is a list of values and policies and concepts that that particular county for that particular party deems to be important. And they usually form the talking points of the participants from that party politically. So individuals running for county or local political positions or public servant positions for their respective parties often pull from that particular platform to represent the issues already expressed both at the precinct level and the county level. Okay? The county then sends delegates to the state level to represent the values and issues that matter to that county. Do you see how it kind of builds up when you see how it says all politics are local, right? And then that county, who then sends delegates to the state convention, now has a representative for them representing the issues and values of that particular county. And again, usually state conventions happen every year, usually, right? So both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party have state conventions in which delegates representing counties in that state voice the concerns of the people from that county told to them via representatives from the precincts. At the state convention, a state party platform is created for which all the political participants operate off of, right? So they're policy items that at that time the state feels are important. Now, delegates representing the county, they vote for that platform, right? They argue, they take the floor. Some county might disagree with a platform plank that another party supports, and they have an opportunity to argue, go back and forth. I mean, these conventions take hours, sometimes all day, right? And they argue and so on and so forth. But ultimately, at these conventions, a party platform is accepted, a state party platform is accepted, and delegates are selected to then represent each state at the national convention. Now, at the national convention, delegates then not only select the national party platform, but they then also select the nominee for president of the United States of America for their respective parties. Now, generally speaking, it is a true representative democracy, generally speaking, where the votes that are cast in the primary are completely reflected in the delegates and who they end up selecting as the party's nominee. But that is not always the case. In some cases, just like in the general election, in some cases, the candidate who receives the most primary votes fails to secure the majority of delegate votes. And in that case, the candidate who receives the majority of the actual votes loses the nomination. And the person who didn't receive the majority of the primary votes wins the election simply because they won the majority of delegate votes. That is very, very, very important to remember because it is a representative democracy in this case. It's not a direct democracy. So, in the case of the President of the United States, your vote doesn't directly go to selecting that individual. Your vote is calculated and tallied, but then it is up to the elector or the delegate to then select the nominee or the president, respectively. Right? So that's very, very important to realize that when you go to the ballot box and you circle your favorite candidate, your vote isn't going directly to elect that candidate. What happens is parties have rules in regards to the electors, in regards to the delegates, and it goes by state level, right? State by state, they get to decide how they want to operate in regards to elections. And then that delegate is pledged to support that particular candidate. Now, they don't always have to vote for the candidate that the people selected. In that case, we have what is known as a faithless elector or a faithless delegate. Now, there are measures to discourage that, but it does happen where a delegate or an elector votes for whoever they want votes for whoever they want, regardless of the outcome of the primary or the general election. Okay. So that is really, really important. And is why the conversations that are going on right now regarding the Democratic convention that is coming up are so important because the nominee is actually chosen at that point and is not chosen upon conclusion of the primary voting process. So that is very, very important and is why the conversation regarding who will be the nominee of the Democratic Party is so incredibly important because the Democratic Party, who is yet to have their convention, has technically yet to have chosen their official nominee. So I think we covered a lot regarding the two oldest political parties in the world, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and how ultimately the President of the United States is selected. If you want to check out more information, please check it out. There's a lot of really interesting pieces regarding, pledged delegates and unpledged delegates and super delegates and so on and so forth. There is a huge history of, the national convention process changing over time. There's a lot of argument regarding whether we should have, direct democracy or representative democracy. And there is something significant about most people not knowing that we don't have a direct democracy in regards to selection of the chief executive of the executive branch of the United States of America. And we have, in fact, a representative democracy. Most people actually do not know that. And I think that's a huge thing. Whether or not that's a good thing or whether or not it's a bad thing, I don't know. but I think it's worth having a conversation regarding why people don't know about this more, or so on and so forth. You've heard a lot of times, I'm upset of people not voting, or so on and so forth, but it's not followed up with this reminder that it's the electors that select ultimately the next president of the United States, and it is the delegate that selects ultimately the nominee for their respective party. Whew. That was a lot. That was a lot right there. If I miss anything out, please throw it in the comment section. It's just really, really important that we cover a lot of bases. And like I said, I'm going to try to come sit right here every so often, maybe once a month, right? It, we won't have a guest. We'll just sit here and talk about, huge, huge issues. And I just think right now there are no issues right now that are bigger than the convention, and then ultimately the selection of the next president of the United States of America. Huge, 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 huge thing. The biggest thing. Well, maybe not the biggest thing. I know you think like, well, what could be bigger than the president of the United States of America? What could be bigger than the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? There's nothing bigger. Well, I would say NVIDIA. NVIDIA is bigger. Now you might ask, what is NVIDIA? What is NVIDIA? What is NVIDIA? Well, listen, if you have heard anything about artificial intelligence, then you indirectly have heard about NVIDIA. If you've heard anything about cryptocurrency, then you indirectly have probably heard about NVIDIA. Let me just be very, very clear. NVIDIA is one of, if not the most valuable company in the entire world. I hope I said that right. Well, if you don't know what I mean by valuable, let me just tell you what I mean. What I mean by valuable, I mean this company is worth $3.34 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Most people get excited about million with an M or billion with a B, but we're talking about trillion. That's more valuable than many nations, right? I hope I said that clearly. 3.34 trillion. Like I said, making it one of, if not the most valuable company in the entire world. They weren't always the most valuable company in the world. In fact, the company that here at 2024 is looked at as the most valuable company in the world started in 1990. In the 1990s, by three individuals. Let me say who they are. Jitson Wang, Chris Malachowski, and Curtis Prim. And get this, the company was started in a Denny's diner in California. Now, early on, they were focused on technology, absolutely. I mean, they are a technology company, but they were focused on making chips to make video games better. Make video games better. Now, you might not think, if you're listening to this now, what's the point of making video games? But I'll tell you right now that a lot of people play video games. Video games is probably one of the biggest industries in the entire world. And just because you don't play it doesn't mean that your child doesn't play it. The video game industry is said to be worth more than the sporting industry, all the major sports combined, whether it's the NFL, NBA, MLB, NHL, all of those combined. The video game industry is said to be worth more than that. So if you haven't been paying attention to video games, then you might not have been paying attention to the right thing at all. But when this company was starting up and really trying to focus on making video games better, there were a lot of naysayers. One of the things that you have to realize about companies that we now look at being some of the most valuable companies ever is that when they started, they had to convince people that something was going to be important that wasn't currently viewed as being important. That's a really, really hard thing. right? That's the thing about being a visionary, right? It's about having a vision. You want to know the difference between a visionary and somebody who's not a visionary? Hopefully, I say this right. I got this from the motivational speaker Les Brown. Here's the difference between being a visionary and not being a visionary. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, maybe you're not a visionary. All right, check this out. A non-visionary will say something like, "I believe it when I see it." You've heard that before? Like really smart people say it, really skeptical people say it. They're not visionaries, right? People who are not visionaries say, "I believe it when I see it." Yeah, yeah, yeah. I believe it when I see it. Blah, 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 blah. If you are offended by my description of you, good. I'm talking about you, right? The majority of the world are not visionaries, and that's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine. But again, the person who is not a visionary says, "I believe it when I see it." The visionary says, "If I believe it, then I can see it." You see the difference? Someone who's not a visionary says, "I believe it when I see it." The visionary says, "If I believe it, then I can see it." They see something that most people cannot see. And this was the case with NVIDIA. They knew they wanted to make something great. They knew they wanted to make chips that power technology. They first focused on video games. They wanted to make graphics. They wanted to make video games look crisper and better and more involved, right? They wanted you to really be sucked into the game. And in order to do that, they needed technology to make it possible. And NVIDIA was successful at that. They were successful at that. And they were becoming more successful as a technology company because of that. So you've got a company that started at Denny's that said they wanted to make chips to make the graphics and the video game experience better. People didn't know why anybody would want to do that, but NVIDIA knew that that was an important thing. And not only did they believe that that was an important thing, they went out and did it, and they created a chip, they created components, they created hardware that allowed for video games to improve and get better and get better and get better and get better. So they were becoming successful. But for NVIDIA, this was only the tip of the iceberg. If you don't know what that saying means, you can only see a little bit of the iceberg. Above the water, only the tip is visible. But underneath the water, a mountain of ice exists. So when you see just the tip of the iceberg, you're missing everything beneath the surface of the water. This is only the tip of the iceberg in regards to NVIDIA's ultimate trajectory. A huge, a huge advent or a huge industry would come onto the market, would burst onto the market, which needed more powerful computers, more capable computers, more powerful computing. And that industry was cryptocurrency. Individuals operating in the cryptocurrency environment, they needed computing power that was far beyond what you and I may need to do these podcasts in our offices. They needed supercomputers, and those supercomputers needed chips and processing capacity that was beyond what was currently available. But see, the thing is NVIDIA was working really hard to create the best chips, to create the best GPUs, to create more powerful computers. And so they were the only player in that arena at the time. And so when the industry emerged for cryptocurrency, NVIDIA was there to supply the necessary computing capacities and capabilities needed by operators in the cryptocurrency industry, taking NVIDIA to a whole new level. But even that was still just the tip of the iceberg. It wouldn't be until the concept of artificial intelligence became an actual reality that NVIDIA found itself as one of the most valuable companies in the entire world. Basically, artificial intelligence is allowing thought and intelligence by computers. Well, thinking is something that's very, very complicated. It requires action potential, sodium potassium exchange. These are things that happen in your mind, one of the most complicated organs in all of nature. How then do you replicate these processes in computing terms to create what we now call artificial intelligence? Well, you require dramatically improved computing power. And that was only made possible by the chips that were being produced by NVIDIA. So when you have the emergence of companies such as OpenAI and so many other companies that are now utilizing artificial intelligence, which is revolutionizing the way we do everything. When I say disruptive technology, I mean that in the strongest sense. The way that artificial intelligence is going to change the economic and social landscape of our world is beyond my capacity to explain it. And it's all made possible by the capacities afforded to them by NVIDIA. The chips, the GPUs of the company is revolutionizing the way we do everything. We will now be able to create artwork, to create speeches, to create movies, to create images, photos, so on and so forth, by leveraging artificial intelligence as a tool and as a companion in our work. And that is made possible by the chips created by NVIDIA, making it the most valuable company in the world. I strongly encourage you, if you haven't checked out any information on NVIDIA, just check it out. It's an amazing company with a humble beginning, telling two stories, telling a story about innovation, but it also tells a story about visionaries from humble beginnings, creating what is now the most valuable company in the entire world. So we covered two huge issues today, two huge issues, and hopefully you took something away from both of them. We first discussed our electoral process for selecting one of the most powerful positions in all the world, the President of the United States. We went from the precinct level all the way to the National Convention and then beyond to the process of the Electoral College, ultimately selecting the President of the United States. We talked about how it's not a direct democracy, but a representative democracy. And we also went further to say that it is interesting how most believe that it's actually a direct democracy and not a representative democracy. And we'll probably have to have a conversation about the implications of that misunderstanding, right? But we're not there yet. We'll probably discuss that on a later episode. And then we went on to talk about NVIDIA, the most valuable company in the world, and its humble beginnings at a Denny's diner to now being worth over $3 trillion. Again, that is trillion with a T. Let me make sure I said that number right. $3.34 trillion. That is absolutely enormous. I am Richard Watkins, the host of the Richard Watkins Podcast, reminding you that the more you learn, the more you realize how very little you know. I hope you learned something here today. Please join us every single Friday with the Richard Watkins Podcast, where we bring together policymakers and thought leaders to talk about some of the most pressing issues in the entire world. Again, I am your humble host, Richard Watkins. Thank you so very much for joining me today, and I hope that you have an absolutely wonderful day. Take care.